Good afternoon and welcome to the National Cancer Institute's Facebook Live event on the latest research for advanced breast cancer. My name is Alexandra Zimmer. I'm a physician and oncologist, clinical oncologist, and I was trained initially in Brazil, and then I worked a little bit in Europe, and now I work here with the Women's Malignancies group branch, where I help to develop clinical trials. I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Stan Lipkowitz today, that is the chief of the NCI's Women's Malignancies branch. Dr. Lipkowitz, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your work at NCI, please?
So I'm a medical oncologist who is trained at the NCI, and I both have clinical responsibility seeing breast cancer patients primarily, and also have a laboratory that does both basic and translational research. And by that I mean research looking at how cancer cells work and how they're different from normal cells, and the translational part is, can we exploit that for developing new therapies for breast cancer. I also see patients as part of our clinical trials over here at NCI, and then also see patients in the breast cancer clinic at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center.
So thank you, and for those that are watching there, we invite you to your on-topic questions during this event. As you have questions, you can ask them in the comment sections that we have, and we'll try to answer them as we have time through the end of this event. Let's get started then. Can you tell us, Dr. Lipkowitz, about the type of breast cancer research that NCI does?
So the NCI has a broad spectrum of research. We work in what is known as the intramural program, where there are essentially labs and clinics at NCI. And in those clinics and laboratories, there are researches that are basic research, looking at the fundamental causes of cancer and the mechanisms that differ between cancer cells and normal cells. There's also translational research, and there are many investigators trying to turn that information into clinically useful therapies. And finally, there are clinical trials that go on within the intramural program. But in addition to the studies that are going on the site at the National Cancer Institute, there are parts of NCI, for example, the Division of Cancer Epidemiology and Genetics, which do large-scale genetic and molecular genetic studies to look at the causes of a variety of cancers, including breast cancer, the outcomes for cancers, or the side effects of the treatments of cancer. In addition, there's a division known as CTEP, which funds many of the clinical trials that go on outside of NCI in cooperative groups or at other academic universities. And finally, the NCI in general funds research around the country and many universities to study cancer.
All right, so should we talk a little bit about the research that we do in the Women's Malignancies group related to breast cancer?
Sure. So in our group, we have a number of investigators who are studying breast cancer in the labs in a variety of different ways. So for example, in my own lab, as I said, we have studies that are looking at how the breast cancer cells respond to external signals from the environment that cause them to grow, and how this works in normal cells and how is it different in cancer cells. In addition, we have translational research trying to utilize what we've learned from understanding how these cells grow and divide, and seeing if we can cause the cells to undergo cell death by triggering certain pathways that are common to all cells, but can we specifically trigger them in the cancer cells? As a consequence of this research, we began studying a drug called ONC201, and again, what we found is that it could trigger death in certain sites of cancer cells, and specifically in breast cancer cells, whereas it doesn't seem to do that in normal cells. And as a result of this, we've developed a clinical trial, and I'll let Alex tell you a little bit about the clinical trial.
Mm-hmm. So we have a clinical trial that is about to open, should be open in the next month or so, that is using the ONC201, that is this treatment evaluated at Dr. Lipkowitz's lab. And it is an oral drug that patients will take once a week. And the idea is to offer this drug to patients either with triple negative or hormone receptor positive breast cancer that have metastatic disease already. So for the hormone receptor positive breast cancer, it will be those patients that already received the hormone treatment before and already progressed beyond that line, either the drugs that you may have heard of, tamoxifen, anastrozole, exemestane, something like that, and maybe palbociclib, abemaciclib or ribociclib are beyond that line, and we will offer this further treatment that it will be this drug. For the triple negative patients, again, metastatic patients that had already received some treatment with chemotherapy and need another treatment, also this drug will be available for them. It's been researched already in what we call phase 1 studies, when we try to see how the side effects work for the patients, and it's been seen to be very tolerable. Main side effects are fatigue, some minor things like gastrointestinal, like a little diarrhea or nausea effects, but nothing major than that. So we want to evaluate and offer that to these patients.
And an important part of the clinical trials that we do at the NCI is to incorporate research biopsies of the patient's tumors. And one of the important questions we want to answer is, when the drug works, what did the tumor look like, or why did it work in some patients, not in others? And also in patients who are receiving treatment, can we see changes in the tumor that reflect what we think the drug should be doing to the tumor in terms of how it's leading to cell death? As another example, there's an investigator in our department, Patricia Stieg, who's one of the world's experts at studying metastatic breast cancer and cancer in general. And she's developed studies in her lab looking at brain metastasis. And in her studies, she found that a drug that's been approved for the use in brain tumors like glioblastoma could prevent the development of metastatic disease. So this is an exciting result in that it was very effective in these preclinical studies for preventing metastasis in both triple negative and HER2 positive breast cancer. So again, we've developed a trial, and Alex, why don't you tell them about the study?
So this study is already opened, and it's a little bit specific. So we are open to hear from you guys if you have questions more about it. But the idea is that the temozolomide is an oral drug as well, and will be offered to patients that have HER2 positive breast cancer and developed brain metastases, up to 3 lesions in the brain that were amenable or were they were received recently treatment with stereotactic radiation or surgery, meaning the disease was removed from the brain, and then the idea is that we will give temozolomide to prevent that from coming back. And we want to see if that works, because the previous work in Dr. Stieg's lab showed that was really effective in that sense. These patients will receive the Kadcyla or TDM1 as a drug to control the systemic disease that they may have, like metastases that they may have in other areas beyond the brain. So that trial is open. Any patient that have questions or people that have questions about that, we are open to answer those. And also this we plan to in the future to extend to other maybe triple negative patients and so on. So moving on from that, what opportunities do you see in breast cancer research currently that should be evaluated?
So I think one of the major problems in breast cancer is that while we've made tremendous advances in the early stages of breast cancer and treating patients who present with stage 1, 2, or 3 operable breast cancer, and in curing those patients, once patients' disease spreads beyond the breast and the local lymph nodes, it's for the most part incurable. So, and that is for all subtypes of breast cancer, including estrogen receptor or ER positive breast cancer, HER2 positive breast cancer, and triple negative. And while they differ a lot in the aggressiveness of the disease, they all are really incurable at that point. So I think one of the opportunities, if you will, is to understand better how to treat patients who develop metastatic disease, and also how better to prevent metastatic disease from developing in the first place. I think those are probably two of the biggest opportunities. Another area of research in all types of cancer, including breast cancer, is moving away from biopsying the tumors to get additional information, and we can talk more about this later perhaps, but so-called liquid biopsies, where you take samples of the blood and then assess them either for circulating tumor cells or circulating DNA from the tumor cells, in order to characterize the tumor without having to do repeated biopsies of the tumor, which are often very difficult to do. This has potential for both the detection and the treatment of cancer.
All right, so if any of you are just joining it, I want to welcome you to the National Cancer Institute's Facebook Live event. And we have been talking about the latest in research for advanced breast cancer. If you have any question for us, please feel free to ask the questions in the comment section that you have in the video, and we will do our best to answer that by the end of the session. Let's continue a little bit with our talk here. And what would you consider are the most urgent areas of research in breast cancer?
So I think there's several areas that really need a lot of more research to develop better therapies. One of those is the treatment of triple-negative breast cancer. We've made tremendous progress, again, in hormone receptor-positive cancers using targeted endocrine therapies, and in HER2-positive breast cancer using targeted therapies to the HER2 protein. But triple-negative breast cancer is a group of breast cancers that has had difficulty identifying specific targets that we can use for better treatment of these. So that's one urgent area. A second one, which we talked about a little bit before in terms of our clinical trial, is the development of brain metastasis in breast cancer. As we've gotten better at treating early-stage breast cancer, or even treating patients with endocrine-positive or HER2-positive breast cancer, more and more patients are developing brain metastasis as a site of recurrence, and this has been very difficult to treat. So I think that's a very important area. And another area is in resistance to therapy. So one of the examples is endocrine therapy, which is a mainstay of treatment for the majority of breast cancer patients who have hormone receptors. But many of them ultimately will develop resistance, especially in the advanced setting, to endocrine therapy. And so there's a number of avenues of research that are going on, but I think that's a very important area.
And then about the metastatic breast cancer, what kind of research is happening currently in that area?
Again, I think many investigators both here and around the country are interested in better treatments for metastatic cancer. And I think the kind of research that's going on, again, here and elsewhere, are to begin to look at the genomics or how the genes of the cancer cells are different from the normal cells in the body, to try to identify how the cells are dysregulated, and use that information for better treatment. In addition, people are using a variety of techniques, either bioinformatic techniques or using genomic information, as I just described, to develop new therapies for breast cancer, especially in metastatic breast cancer, to see if we can get better responses and actually improve survival in those patients.
All right. And in terms of clinical trials, how do you see that as an option for advanced breast cancer?
You know, I think because advanced breast cancer is a type of cancer that we lack curative therapy for, I think it's very important for many of us to be doing clinical trials, and I think it's certainly an option for patients. There are established therapies for many subsets of breast cancer. So again, even in the metastatic setting, many patients with hormone receptor positive tumors will respond to endocrine therapy. So we have therapies that work, but they work for a while, and they, in general, don't cure those patients. In addition, in HER2 positive patients, we have therapies that have been shown to extend survival quite dramatically since their introduction more than a decade ago. These therapies, these patients with HER2 positive disease used to live on average less than 2 years, and now their survival is out beyond 5 years, but still we're not curing most of those patients. So without clinical trials, I don't think we'll be able to push or advance the therapy for these breast cancers. And I think certainly for patients, once they've been treated with what would be considered standard of care endocrine therapy or HER2-directed therapies, I think certainly it's reasonable to consider whether a clinical trial is right for them.
All right. And in terms of immunotherapy in breast cancer, is that a focus of research?
So immunotherapy is probably one of the most exciting areas in all of cancer therapy over the last couple of years, and the effectiveness of immunotherapy in a number of different cancers has everybody very interested and very excited. In breast cancer, so far the data are that only a minority of patients respond to immunotherapy, and in general those seem to be clustered in the triple-negative breast cancer group. So for example, patients with endocrine or hormone receptor-positive breast cancer haven't been generally found to respond to immunotherapy, and there's a lot of unanswered questions then about who responds and who doesn't, and how can we improve on that. So there are many people here and elsewhere who are trying to develop ways to detect who should be treated with immunotherapy and benefit from immunotherapy, and how to improve on that by combining it with other agents. So for example, we have a trial, and I'll let Alex describe our trial, where we're doing exactly that in triple-negative breast cancers, of trying to combine immunotherapy with other drugs.
Mm-hmm. So we have one trial open already for triple negative breast cancer patients that actually offers the combination of an immune targeted drug, that is the durvalumab, is an anti-PD-L1 agent, a drug, that is combined to the olaparib, that is a PARP inhibitor. Again, as Dr. Lipkowitz also explains, all of them were evaluated before in triple negative breast cancer specifically, showed some response, not in all patients, and like a small response, and then our idea is to combine both of them and see if the combined use could offer a greater benefit for these patients. It is open, again, triple negative patients that have metastatic disease that progressed to previous chemotherapy treatment are eligible for this trial. And again, another interesting part of it, as Dr. Lipkowitz was mentioning before, is we have as a request biopsies, interventional radiology guided, not a surgical biopsy, but so we can look at the tumor in the beginning before the start of this treatment, and then after 15 days when people already started the treatment, and try to understand better in the future how to offer that, select better the patients to offer that treatment.
And again, going back to to what other people are doing, there are a number of groups at National Cancer Institute who are studying better ways to use immunotherapy to treat many cancers, but including breast cancer. So, for example, Dr. Rosenberg has cell-based therapies that he's trying to target to the specific mutations in patients' cancers, and that includes breast cancer, and he's had some dramatic responses in patients, including in a patient with triple-negative breast cancer. There are other groups that are trying to develop vaccines for breast cancer, again, to try to get the immune system to see the breast cancers better. And that includes people like Jeff Schlom's group or Jay Bersofsky's group, who are looking at ways to use the immune system to target the cancers. Again, all of this is based on trying to improve the number of patients who will respond to immunotherapy and to improve the depth of the responses, if you will, how well the responses work in patients at the same time.
All right, so one other thing for our viewers, if you like to search on your own for any kind of NCI-supported clinical trial, we encourage you to visit our website, and that will be trials.cancer.gov. Trials.cancer.gov, and there's a simple search from there. You can start from there and then can connect and link you to other resources that can help you. So we can take some additional questions now. Let's see, I think we have one already. That's how many types of mutations are there that cause breast cancer?
So it depends on which question you're asking. So there are two genomes, if you will, when you think of a cancer patient. There's your normal genome, and then there's the cancer's genome. So starting with the types of mutations that occur in your normal genome, there are mutations that we know that we find in patients, and it's a minority of the patients with breast cancer. And these patients are at high risk of developing breast cancer. And these are things like the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes and a number of other genes, P53, all of which are known to be associated with a high risk of breast cancer. So that's one set of mutations. And while in general, most of the mutations or most of the genes add up to probably, that account for most of these familial breast cancers or genetic breast cancers, probably occur in 5 or 6 genes, but there probably are at least 20 or 30 others that also contribute at a lower prevalence to the incidence of breast cancer. But when you ask how many mutations cause breast cancer, the majority of patients with breast cancer don't have a mutation in their own genes that cause it. It's a mutation that developed that led to the breast cancer. And while there are certain genes that are stronger predisposing genes or stronger mutations, so for example P53, which can be found in patients' germline genome, is also found in about a third of patients who develop breast cancer. So those are mutations that occurred in the tumors and led to the development of tumor. So in terms of the number of genes, it's not really clear what that number is at this point. There are only 3 or 4 genes that seem to occur at such high frequencies, such as P53. And some of those are ones we've already talked about, the amplifications of the gene HER2, or mutations in P53, or mutations in another gene known as PI3 kinase, occur in at least 10% of the patients. But then as we've looked further with genomic sequencing, we find that there are many genes, and I don't really know what that number is, but certainly tens of genes, if not upwards of 100 genes that may be found as contributing to cancer in a small fraction of patients. So each of those occur in only 1% or fewer of patients. So there are many, many genes that contribute, which is one of the reasons it's been so difficult to identify targeted therapies. The genes that occur frequently, such as amplification of HER2, have given us good signposts of genes to target. But when you have genes that may only occur in 1 or 2%, or mutations in genes that only occur in 1 or 2% of patients, it becomes much harder to think about designing therapies and testing them when they only work in a very small subset of patients. But there probably are easily dozens of genes that are contributing to the development of cancer.
And then we have a next question here that is, can you talk more about what translational therapies are coming from the research?
So I guess I can focus mostly on the work that's going on around us at National Cancer Institute. So again, as I've already described, there is work from people like Pat Stieg, who, in thinking about metastatic cancer, has focused on can she develop therapies that either treat or prevent it. And what she's finding in the lab is that most of the therapies that are effective seem to prevent metastasis rather than shrink existing metastasis. So she's working very hard to develop new therapies, and again, the temozolomide treatment for brain mets is one of the therapies that came directly out of her research. For my own research, we've had, as we've described, research on a small molecule called ONC201, which was developed by a company called Oncoceutics. But we've been studying in the lab and studying how it works in cancer patients, and again, that's led to research. And this is just a microcosm of what exists all around the country. There are many of us who are focused on studying pathways in the lab and studying cells in the lab and seeing what kills them, and then trying to use that in therapy. I think another large area with that, again, is the immunotherapy. There are groups at NCI and elsewhere who are trying to improve the efficacy or the effectiveness of immunotherapy by manipulating the immune system. So one way are to give these checkpoint inhibitors, which have been approved for many cancers, but in addition, what can be combined with them to enhance their efficacy. So there's a lot of work that's going on that would translate as translational.
Right. And then the question, why is metastatic breast cancer almost always fatal while other cancers are not?
So I'm not sure that I would agree completely with that. Most metastatic cancers, unfortunately, especially of epithelial malignancies, are unfortunately incurable and are usually fatal. So breast cancer isn't unique in that setting. What's fortunate about breast cancer is in the majority of patients we can detect it while it's still confined to the breast and the local lymph nodes, and those patients are curable. Once it's spread beyond that, the cancer becomes incurable, and we'll come back to some reasons that I think that may be the case. But I think that's true for many cancers. I think colon cancer is another example where when found early, it can be cured, but once it's spread beyond the colon and into other organs, it's also incurable. And I think that's true for lung cancer, for pancreatic cancer, and others. So I think there are many examples where metastatic cancer is incurable. There are some examples, I should say, where it's curable, and it's an interesting question to ask. The other question is, why are the curable ones curable? So I think the best example of that is testicular cancer, which is an incredibly aggressive tumor. It grows very quickly. And yet, no matter how widespread it is, patients seem to be able to be cured. And obviously, there are many people, Lance Armstrong is a great example, who was cured of his testicular cancer and then went on to win the Tour de France multiple times. So I think most metastatic cancers, it turns out, are incurable, unfortunately. The question of why that is, of course, the focus of a lot of research, but I think there are 2 or 3 factors. As cancers develop, they develop more and more mutations. And those mutations make them more aggressive and also more resistant to treatment. The second problem is that the more a cancer is metastatic, the more cells there are, and there more likely are to be a resistant cell. Even if the resistant cell only occurs in 1 in a million cells, as you get more and more cells and billions of cells, you're certainly going to have resistant cells to any therapy. So I think that's why metastatic cancer is likely to be less curable or incurable in the case of breast cancer compared to the early stages of cancer.
And then we have the question, could you please comment about chemoresistance development following neoadjuvant chemotherapy regarding CSC selection?
So I think what you're asking is, does the chemotherapy select for cancer stem cells? So first of all, what we know about neoadjuvant chemotherapy compared to adjuvant chemotherapy is in general, they both seem to work. So, and I think I know where this question comes from. But let's start with what's known about adjuvant and neoadjuvant chemotherapy for breast cancer. There have been many studies with many tens of thousands of patients now showing that adjuvant therapy, which treats the micrometastatic disease that's spread throughout the body before the surgeon could actually remove the tumor, is effective at killing those cells because fewer people recur and die from breast cancer. In a number of studies that compared doing the chemotherapy before, or neoadjuvant chemotherapy, or after surgery, what was found in general in those studies is that it doesn't seem to make a difference, that you get the same benefit. And so we're curing people. So everyone out there shouldn't all of a sudden say, oh my goodness, I don't want to get neoadjuvant chemotherapy, I only want adjuvant chemotherapy, because the bulk of the data suggests that it does work. But there were some recent papers that suggest that neoadjuvant chemotherapy can stimulate the dissemination of disease of the tumor cells, or can kill off the tumor cells that are not stem cells or the cancer repopulating cells. So I think that is a concern. I think people are working on those aspects to try to develop therapies that might target both the what we would call tumor-initiating cells or stem cells, as well as the bulk of the tumor, which may not have the stem cell features. But I think overall the data so far have shown that both neoadjuvant chemotherapy and adjuvant chemotherapy are beneficial and not harmful. But I do think that people do worry about chemo resistance after neoadjuvant therapy. But I think that's an area that's not completely well defined as yet.
All right. And there's a question here about what is the most common metastasis site for breast, and is that a research focus?
You want to take that, Alex?
Yeah, well, we have kind of a description of or knowledge of which sites are the common ones for breast. It's not to say that it's impossible to appear anywhere else, but commonly will be liver, and then lung, lymph nodes close to the cervical mediastinal area, and then we have the brain area for the specific subtypes like HER2 positive and triple negative that are most commonly the areas. And the question I think mainly there is because it's considered like a sanctuary where the difficulty of getting the chemotherapy agents and other agents like the trastuzumab, that is an antibody, to get into the brain area. So it's been studied, of course, especially the brain area, because of the difficulty to get treatment to that specific area of metastases, as I explained, because of the tumor, the brain tumor. The blood-brain barrier, or blood-tumor barrier, as we know better now. And the main treatments that we have is really radiation or surgery, and nothing much more than that worked so far. And one of the ways of research is, like Dr. Lipkowitz mentioned before, Dr. Stieg works on that, as several other researchers outside of NIH, and one of the trials that we have is just asking that question: can we prevent then the development instead of treating the lesions, like looking into another way of doing it?
Yeah. One or two comments about that. One is to mention also a very common site of recurrence is bone in patients with breast cancer.
Yeah.
But also the different subtypes of breast cancer may have slightly different tropisms. I think, as Alex said, all of them can go all of the places that we've mentioned. But for example, hormone receptor positive breast cancer much more commonly metastasizes to the bone, whereas I think HER2 positive or the triple negative breast cancers are more likely to metastasize, especially as first site, to places like the liver or the lungs or the brain. And there is a lot of research looking at the site specificity. There are researchers like Dr. Stieg here, or Joanne Massaguet at Sloan Kettering, who are trying to who have developed cell lines that go specifically to different sites of metastasis. So they've taken a cell line that can be put into a mouse, it forms tumors, and then it spreads to different organs. And by selecting for ones that spread to one organ or another, they can begin to study what controls which site, what controls how the tumor metastasizes to those sites. An important question then would be, can the treatments that prevent metastasis, like for example in our study with temozolomide, which may prevent brain metastasis, that may or may not have any effect on metastasis to other sites? And I think that's an important question because we may need to think about multiple therapies that treat or prevent metastasis at different sites. But I think there are people working on that both here and elsewhere.
And then the next question, what effect does BRCA1 or BRCA2 have on advanced breast cancer, if any?
So again, these are two genes. I think many people are aware of them. These are the most commonly mutated genes that occur in patients' germline, so their own DNA, that lead to a high predisposition for breast cancer. While there are some differences, one is there tends to be a skewing in the type of breast cancer. So while most patients with breast cancer develop, sort of without a mutation in their germline, develop hormone receptor positive breast cancer, patients who have BRCA1 mutated gene in their germline are more likely to develop a triple negative breast cancer, although patients with BRCA2 are more likely to develop a hormone receptor positive breast cancer. Now, in general, when people develop these breast cancers, their outcomes are not that different fundamentally from patients with breast cancer that develop what we call sporadically or just by chance, so that the treatments, the upfront treatment for these patients, in terms of surgery and adjuvant or neoadjuvant chemotherapy and radiation, is and should be the same as for those other for patients who don't carry these mutations. In terms of advanced breast cancer, again, it's not clear that patients having one or another of these BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutations have fundamentally different outcomes from patients with, say, triple negative breast cancer that has a normal BRCA1. But there are some therapies now that have been developed in advanced breast cancer that may be beneficial in these patients. In particular, one of them are, one class of drugs are PARP inhibitors, and recently a large study with the PARP inhibitor olaparib have shown that patients who have metastatic breast cancer and who carry germline mutations in BRCA1 and 2 and whose tumors arise because of that seem to get significant benefit, more benefit from a PARP inhibitor than they do from chemotherapy in terms of the response to therapy and the time that the therapy works, and with actually less toxicity than chemotherapy. So there are differences in these tumors, and there are many people studying ways to exploit these genetic differences in the tumors for treatment at this point.
Okay. And then another question is, are there symptoms of metastatic breast cancer?
So in most patients who develop metastatic breast cancer, there often are symptoms. When a patient has early stage breast cancer and is treated, at that point they're usually in remission after the surgery, radiation, and systemic therapies. And quite commonly what will happen is those patients will present with a complaint of something hurts, or something's not right, or and that will lead to an investigation that leads to discovering metastatic breast cancer. But the symptoms can be vague. So again, for someone to say, well, I just have some aches, and certainly those of us who treat these patients take those sorts of complaints very seriously. But of course, lots of people have aches for other reasons. So there can be symptoms. They're usually not that specific, but certainly any doctor treating patients with breast cancer who might be in remission question their patients very carefully. Frequently, we often do routine blood tests that may identify patients who have an abnormality in their blood test that makes us look further as well. The symptoms tend to be not that specific, but the doctors take these symptoms much more seriously than in a patient who hasn't had breast cancer.
All right. And then another question, what are the survival rates for metastatic breast cancer, and are they getting better?
So in some types of breast cancer, the answer is they are getting better. So again, I already mentioned that in HER2-positive breast cancer, before the advent of Herceptin, the patients with metastatic HER2-positive breast cancer lived on average around 18 months or little less than 2 years. And with the sequential use of HER2-targeted drugs, including trastuzumab, pertuzumab, Kadcyla, or TDM1, and other HER2-targeted combinations, Now these patients are living more than 5 years. So that's significant. So that's clearly in that subgroup, which used to be the one of the most aggressive types of breast cancer with perhaps the shortest survival, are living longer. In endocrine receptor or hormone receptor positive breast cancer, on average the patients live 2 to 3 years as a median. But all of us have seen patients who either have the disease be much more aggressive, but also there are patients who are alive for 10 and 12 and 15 years with metastatic hormone receptor positive breast cancer. Although, and there are treatments like endocrine treatments, it's not clear though that we've really improved survival very much in that group of patients. I think the therapies work and they're effective at controlling the disease and symptoms. I'm not sure in hormone receptor positive cancer that I can say that we've improved survival very much, at least not recently. I think the advent of endocrine therapy, tamoxifen, and then aromatase inhibitors probably improved it somewhat. But again, most of those patients in general are not curable. And again, in the last subset of breast cancer, triple negative breast cancer, I think it would be hard to point to any of the therapies that we routinely use that improve survival. So that, the good news is we have therapies that work, especially in the early setting, and we have some therapies that work in hormone receptor positive disease. But at this point, I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done to develop treatment that's truly pushes out survival for the majority of patients with metastatic breast cancer or cures them.
All right, and that was our last question. This is the time that we have today for these questions. I would like to thank you, all of you that joined us for this latest Facebook Live event from the National Cancer Institute. And thank you for all these comments. And if you like to watch this video again or recommend it to someone else, you can view the archived version on the National Cancer Institute's Facebook page. It will also be available soon in the National Cancer Institute's YouTube channel. And any questions that we didn't get to today, we'll do our best to answer then following this event. Okay, thank you again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute, cancer.gov, 1-800-4CANCER. Produced November 2017. U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute, cancer.gov, 1-800-4CANCER. Produced October 2017.